Hello, hey, how are you? Welcome to the Otherppl Show. I'm Brad Listi, and I am talking to you from Los Angeles, California. It is good to be with you. I have a great episode for you today. My guest is John Keene. He is the author of a new poetry collection entitled Punks, New and Selected Poems. It is available now from The Song Cave. This is a remarkable collection from one of our finest poets. John Keene is an acclaimed fiction writer, translator, poet, MacArthur Fellow, and I thought it would be a good idea to start things off by hearing him read a poem from his new collection. This is a poem called Serenade.
I love you. Taxis honk and hum, stirring snow-drunk Manhattan from its January slumber. Robins weave an April melody. I love you above the midday symphony of 18 million souls. Evening, July, and she whose body writes in the lyric of Tai Chi, I love you upon the rain-glazed village playground. Now night extends its raven hands to light the September moon's new lantern as sirens and cicadas serenade us. I love you.
All right, that is John Keene reading Serenade, a poem from his new book entitled Punks. Just a remarkable poetry collection drawn from the span of John Keene's life, and it includes previously unpublished and brand new work. This is a book that shows great range. It is a musical book. It is a book that feels very much like a complete statement. It gives you a real sense of John Keene's life and times. It gives you a real sense of life itself. This is not a slim volume. It really packs a punch, and I greatly enjoyed it. My conversation with John Keene is coming up in just a bit. Today's episode is brought to you by Echo Books, publisher of the novel Drowning Practice by Mike McGinnis, due out on March 15th. Drowning Practice tells the story of a mother and a daughter trying to save each other's lives at what could be the end of the world. This is literary speculative fiction at its very best. Kirkus calls Drowning Practice, quote, twisty and moving, an apocalypse novel that will keep readers guessing until the last page. And Matt Bell calls Drowning Practice, quote, the best new novel I've read in ages. That's Drowning Practice by Mike McGinnis, available now from Echo Books. All right, so I do want to say some quick thank yous to some people who have pre-ordered my new novel. Thank you to Brad Wojak, David Quigg, Sally Graham, Kelly Earl, Keely Thomas Morgan, and Rachel Shapiro. Thank you guys. I appreciate it. For those of you who are new to the program, I have a novel of my own coming out in May. It is called Be Brief and Tell Them Everything. And I would love it if you pre-ordered it. It really helps. And if you do pre-order it and you send me a screenshot of your proof of purchase, I will send you a note in the mail along with an official Otherppl sticker. I will also give you a shout out right here on the podcast in the monologue. So if you would like to pre-order my book, again, it is called Be Brief and Tell Them Everything. Just go to bradlisti.com. It's all right there. It's very easy. Whatever online bookseller you prefer, you can use it. And then afterwards, just email me the screenshot of your proof of purchase. The address is letters@otherppl.com, or else you can DM the show on Twitter or Instagram. Okay? So I did get some listener mail. I would like to get to that real quick. A listener named Landon writes, Dear Brad, I've enjoyed hearing your monologue updates about the publication process. As a longtime listener, I have heard you talk about your book and the difficulties you endured along the way. Congrats on getting it done, though it does make me wonder what motivated you. Why did you put yourself through all this? I'm genuinely curious. Signed, Landon. So thank you, Landon. That's a good question. And really, why does anybody write? Because it's such a lot of work, and it's a difficult work oftentimes. I think it's partly compulsion. I think you're sort of wired to do this for whatever reason. And I'm sure pride has something to do with it. I know that I'm not a person who quits easily once I've set my mind to do something. And I also like the old Don DeLillo line about writing to find out what you know. I think there's some truth in that for me. Or like writing to answer questions that are bothering you. This was certainly the case with Be Brief and Tell Them Everything, as within it I'm trying to address some difficult questions around fatherhood, having children, my son's disabilities in particular, as well as existential questions about grief, death, money, love, all of it. And I think, too, I was trying to write a book that I often say that I want to read. Something that is vulnerable and hopefully unusually honest, rigorous in its thinking, and efficient in its telling. I was just trying to emulate some of the things that I enjoy as a reader, which I think is natural. And the last thing that I'll say is that this book is very much a book that I've had to write. Not to be melodramatic about it, but I don't think that I could have written or could write another book until I got this one out of my system. It was just in the way, if that makes sense. So whatever happens, I'm sincerely relieved to have seen it through. And I hope, Landon, that you and other readers enjoy it when it comes out in May. All right? So thank you for writing. One last time, the book is called Be Brief and Tell Them Everything, due out on May 10th. You can pre-order it over at bradlisti.com right now. So today's guest, again, is John Keene, writer, translator, professor, and artist who in 2018 was named a MacArthur Fellow. In 1989, John Keene joined the Darkroom Writers Collective, and he is a graduate fellow of the Cave Canem Writers' Workshops. I believe I pronounced that correctly. His other books include Annotations and Counter-Narratives, both of which are published by New Directions, as well as several other works, including the poetry collection Seismosis with artist Christopher Stackhouse, and a translation of Brazilian author Hilda Hilst's novel entitled Letters from a Seducer. Through the years, John Keene has received many awards and fellowships, including the Wyndham Campbell Prize, the Whiting Foundation Prize, the Republic of Consciousness Prize, and the American Book Award. He teaches at Rutgers University, Newark. It is a great pleasure to have him here on the program and to learn a little bit about his life and work. His new collection, once again, is called Punks, New and Selected Poems. This is my conversation with John Keene.
What is now called Punks had at its core an earlier manuscript, probably, I think, from the early 2000s. And the earliest version of it, I would say, it might have been even 1997. It was a finalist for, or no, it wasn't even a finalist. It was at I guess it made it several stages into a poetry competition. And then actually the more final version was a finalist for the Cave Canem Prize under a different name. And there were several other projects that kind of are woven into this final collection that I also sought to get published. But every time it seemed like I was going to get it published or I got, a green light of some sort, things fell through. So I actually had gotten to the point where I thought, okay, I'll never publish these poems, in my lifetime or, other than in a little chapbook that came out a few years ago from Seven Kitchens Press called Playland, which has about 15 of the poems here. But it so happened, serendipity still exists. I knew Alan Felsenthal. I'd met Alan some years ago and had followed his press. I was a big fan. I think I said to him at one point that, going to Song Cave's table at the New York Art Book Fair at MoMA PS1 was one of kind of my highlights of visiting that that wonderful gathering every year. So anyway, I think he heard me read, and he asked me if I had if the poem I read or poems I read were part of a collection, and I mentioned I think the little chapbook, and then he said, well, why don't you send me the manuscript? So it actually took a couple years, because when I looked at what I had, I thought, I think I had that sinking feeling that I'd had with the earlier versions of this, the main manuscript, and several like sort of subsidiary manuscripts, which I call the kind of ghost books. But then finally, I think it was early last year, I just forced myself to go back in, revisit everything, rearrange things, and then send it to Alan and Ben Estes, the other editor of the Song Cave. Both of them are wonderful poets in their own right. And they looked it through. They made excellent suggestions. I think, Alan may have said, the general order and the structuring of the book does work. They agreed to include the collaborative poems with Cynthia Gray, Cindy Lore, which was wonderful. I think they also said, usually, nowadays with poetry books, it's a very discrete project, but here, you have a range of poems and a range of forms, but they speak to each other, they work together. And that was something I think I realized when I began to reorder and rearrange things, that yes, this actually could work almost in a kind of symphonic way. So mixtape, anthology, symphony, you can use it in any number of terms, but that's kind of how I look at it now. And I actually feel like I'm sort of amazed when I look at it now that it's in print, to see that in fact it does work. I tell people you can read poems in any order you want, or you can start at the beginning, or you can start at the end and read backward to the front, and you get a range of sort of stories, but there are consistent themes, there's a kind of consistent arc, and you get a really sort of holistic sense of what the book is trying to do.
Okay, so a couple things come to mind as I listen to you. The first of which is that sometimes like delayed gratification can be a real blessing, because you had the ghost book, the ghost books as you call them, earlier versions, not complete, not the completed book that we now have in Punks, but elements of it that you tried to publish independently but didn't find a home for.
Right.
Do you feel a sense of good fortune now in retrospect as you consider the effect that these disparate parts have when they're working together in unison? I feel like there's a real power in this book that might not have existed might not have existed to the degree that it does had these things been published independently. Do you hear what I'm saying?
I do. One of the things I sort of feel is that, some of the poems have a kind of, I'm not talking about the poems about historical personages, right? The persona poems, but I'm thinking about the poems that, describe particular moments in time. And on the one hand, I feel like, okay, it would have been great to have those poems appear closer to the time when that they're invoking, that they're describing. On the other hand, in a very sort of strange way, though I feel like we're distant from those moments, and then in another way they're still with us, right? And so there's a power in not forgetting them, right? So it becomes a kind of project of reclamation and memory, in addition to the kind of, we think about the sort of descriptive and imaginative power that poetry possesses. So in a sense, I think the earlier books would have been very different books, but together, and of course there are many poems. I think one of the reviews, it was a beautiful review in poetry on the poetry website, and one of them noted that sort of picked up that there probably were a lot of poems that were cut. And so that's, I think, also the case, that there are many poems that, are not here that would have filled out those other books. But it's fine, because what's here is what works. And it has a particular kind of impact collectively, but also in terms of the individual poems.
So this poetry collection reads to me, or delivered an impact that is not entirely dissimilar to how I feel after I've read a memoir. And it's working more abstractly and in less of a linear fashion than the typical memoir does. But that was the feeling that I got. There was some feeling of like deep memory work, but also a feeling of completeness. There was just so much there, and I felt like I really got to know you as I read this poetry collection to a degree that distinguishes itself.
One of the things I love about poetry is that, on the one hand, you read poetry for its content. So in the sense that one thinks about a memoir, right? Yes, there are aspects of my personal life are here, right? In poetic form, right? It's not the sort of straightforward shaped narrative that you get in a memoir. On the other hand, poetry is and consists of and in language. So language is absolutely important in poetry. I mean, not all poets feel this way, but I feel this way. The language is important, right? You think about the words. Every word that goes into a poem is essential. So I think that might sort of point to the comment that you're making about abstraction, in the sense that, there is that interesting tension between what's in the poems, but also how they're told. Because how they're told, how they're written, how they unfold matters. And how they unfold individually, and then how they unfold in sections, and then how they unfold collectively. I think there is a kind of accumulative power, right? Cumulative and accumulative power to having all these poems together. I mean, I think about, for example, the poems in the section The Lost World. Those are really poems about, being a young Black queer person, black gay man in the late 80s, early 90s, as HIV was raging, the crack epidemic was raging. We were in, kind of the throes of conservative backlash. But also, they're about being young. I mean, what does it mean to be a young person at a particular time? What does it mean to, on the one hand, have this powerful sense of freedom, and then to also feel that freedom, like, powerfully circumscribed in certain ways, right? Because of who you are, because of the kind of threats that are out there. So, I feel like there's a way in which that I is, of course, as always in the poem, one of the things we always say to students is, right, the I, you want to separate the I in a poem. There's a poetic speaker, a poetic voice, and then there is the author. And between the two, all kinds of things can happen, right? I think about the George Washington Carver poem. That is a poem in George Washington Carver's voice, but that's also filtered through my consciousness, right? I'm focusing on certain aspects of Carver, right? And who I imagine he is and what I imagine his significance is, right? And I wanted to think about, what might a moment in his life, a glimpse into his existence look like? And it's my glimpse, even where there's I think much more distance in terms of, what the poems are, the content of the poems, right? That authorial consciousness, a particular perspective, the aesthetics, are mine, and it connects those poems. This is why I think it's really sort of interesting to think about these poems all together. They connect to those poems that do feel much more directly autobiographical and personal.
Yeah, well, I think it's truer to life, really. When this collection has been called an exploration of the self, or the polyphonic nature of the self, which I think is accurate. And we build our identities. We build them through story. We build them through, these narratives that we construct around our memories, the stories that we tell and retell to ourselves. And we also build our sense of self from other people. We pick and choose little bits and pieces from people we admire, people we know, people we've met, people we've talked to once on a train. It could be anything, really. But that's what I think spoke to me so much about the persona section in particular, but also how it works against other sections that are operating differently. Because if it were just one of these sections alone, it would still be lovely and true to life, but not as complete as the effect that is delivered by all of these sections working in concert. So there's a unique completeness to this collection that I really appreciate.
Thank you. No, it's good to hear. I mean, as I said, I was a little worried when the book was on its way. Once you put a book in the world, you don't have any power over it. It's out there. I mean, you might do PR and, of course, clearly do readings and wonderful conversations like this. But the book is out in the world. It has to speak for itself. And I was a little nervous because I said, I think particularly after my last book, Counter Narratives, people were going to, there was a sort of expectation where you're going to do another Counter Narratives.
Which I should interrupt and just let listeners know that Counter Narratives is a story collection. It's not poetry.
Exactly. It's a collection of stories and novellas. But there are ways in which that book and this book are in conversation. I mean, in direct conversation and indirect conversation, and they flow into each other. That collection, I wanted to write stories that were not at all autobiographical, but of course they're, again, shaped by my consciousness, my perspective. And they focus a lot on history. And here, of course, I think we've been talking about these persona poems and others, more personal poems about my family, particularly my grandfather and grandmother. Those have a historical weight too. But of course, everything has a historical weight, right? A historical heft here once you start to think about it. So in a sense, they're not so different as some people might imagine. But I'm glad to see the reception of Punks. And I just see people posting individual poems that really strike them, on Twitter, for example, or Instagram is really heartening, because, I mean, people have been very moved by poems in this book. And that's what you want as a writer. You want to be able to speak to people and reach people. And sometimes you reach them in ways that you can't imagine or can't foresee. But there's something in the poem, in a story, in a novel that speaks directly to them, right? And might lift them up, or might give them a moment of recognition, or might defamiliarize the world in front of them and transform how they see things, right? Or might inspire them, right? I mean, if they're a writer or if they're not a writer, they say, oh my God, this is a poem I'm going to carry with me today, right? Or I'm going to reread this over and over because it's speaking to me in a particular way. So that's always, I think, a very encouraging thing. And I've been very encouraged by the response so far.
Well, that is the internet as God intended it to be used, right? That's when social media and the internet, like when somebody finds a poem or a piece of writing that they really respond to and they post it, that's really nice. And not only is it a really nice thing to do, but it's also nice that you as the author can often know that your work has landed, whereas previously, I guess, you would have to get a letter or maybe an email.
Yeah, right. You get sometimes you get letters. I've gotten letters, sometimes emails, but most frequently, of course, when I do readings, you do a reading and someone says, "Oh, I really, I love that story," or "That poem spoke to me," and that's as heartening as anything.
Yeah, in person.
Yeah.
Which is rarer and rarer these days. Hopefully we're getting back to it.
in our pandemic-ridden world.
Yeah. I want to talk to you about the title of the collection, Punks, and this word punk, which I did not know until I did a little research that it was used, or it has been used, as a word for gay man.
Yes. So in Black vernacular culture, yes, if you call someone a punk, or you say, don't be a punk, or so-and-so is a punk, that can mean that they're gay. Of course, it can also mean punk, the more basic sense of, unmanly, not so much gay, but just, not strong, weak. Of course, then a punk, just about like hanging out in the corner like a bunch of punks is basically like, like bad people, outlaws. And then, of course, there was punk rock and punk music, which was big when I was young. And so I all of those things together resonated for me. So I said I would call this book Punks. And I also love that, every time when people mention this book, they have to say punks, right? Because with the various shadings implicit in it. I should say that at one point I was thinking of calling it Sissies, but I think there have been a number of books, Sissy, either titled Sissy or Sissies, and I liked Punk and Punks to me, had, as you mentioned, this sort of these added valences that aren't always apparent. But either way, I mean, even I think in a certain way, the organization of the book is almost, in a sense, like, I don't know, like a punk song or something, right? It's like, it's not the usual, that's nice, neat. I mean, it's like, you got one poem that's basically in all caps and, is deeply informed by hip hop. And then you've got other poems that are, like one of the first poems that's in couplets, right? The rhyme in couplets. So, I mean, I feel like, yeah, there's a punk spirit here, a punk in every possible, you know, understanding of that term.
And the photo, it's a beautifully designed book. So credit to the Song Cave. It's a beautiful book to hold, you know, and the photo on the cover I love as well. Can you talk a little bit about that? Is that something that you had a hand in, or is that something that the Song Cave found?
Well, the interesting thing is I come across this photo and saved it. It's like several years ago.
And
it's by
you
the
know what?
photographer.
I don't mean to interrupt, but we should describe a little bit what it looks like for listeners who might not have any kind of visual frame of reference. This is a photo of two black Navy men. Are they sailors? They look like they're
two black sailors. Mm-hmm.
Two black sailors, one of whom is sort of smiling and making a silly face, sticking his tongue out. The other one looking at him with affection, I would say, right?
Right. Both affection and a little bit of a side eye. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's like some interesting, like kind of Mona Lisa almost, like combo, because it's hard to parse, but it's a multitude of things.
Right. Exactly. Well, no, I loved it. I mean, I guess they're navy blues and with the those wonderful little white hats they wear, and one has his tongue out, and the other one, right, is looking at it with the side eye. But it's also there's an element of desire there. It's I think a very queer photo. It's by Alvin Baltrop, who was an amazing African American photographer. He's known for his portraits of New York gay, queer, LGBTQ life, particularly from I think the late '60s through the '80s, maybe even the '90s. He unfortunately, I mean, he did receive some recognition when he was alive, but he was really not as acclaimed as he should have been. And I think when Song Cave and I settled on this photo, Alan may have had several. Alan Felsenthal, one of the editors, may have had several photos in mind. But when we settled on this one, he approached the Alvin Baltrop estate, and they were wonderful. They worked with the Song Cave, and I have this amazing cover, and I love it. I mean, it's a wonderful book. I love looking at this book, and I think a lot of people do too. So that's the other thing too. It's nice to have a book that's nice to look at. It makes people want to pick it up. It makes people want to open it up, and set it on a coffee table or on a bookshelf so people can see it.
Now, some of the poems am I correct that some of the poems in this collection you were working on as early as in high school?
No. I don't know where that came up, but no. The earliest poems in this collection date from the time I was in the Darkroom Collective, which would have been the late 80s, early 90s. So I joined the Darkroom. I went to the Darkroom Collective, started in 1988.
What is it?
It was a collective primarily of young black writers, but also artists, musicians, journalists, interesting people that met at a house on 21 Inman Street in Cambridge, Massachusetts. A lot of sort of reports or discussions of us say that we all were at Harvard, but that's not true. Some people went to Harvard, some people barely, were in school, right? Anywhere. We just sort of gathered together, and actually, let me just credit the three founders, Sharon Strange, Janice Lowe, and Thomas Sayers Ellis. They were friends. They lived in the house at 21 Inman Street, and they went to James Baldwin's funeral and decided, we would love to be able to meet writers like Baldwin, right? While they're still alive. We would like to host them and have them share their work with the community. So it was really geared towards the community. It was not part of any formal institution. That ethic of the collective was still in the air, because this was in the late 80s. But of course, many of the people that we had interacted with were products of the 60s and 70s, right? That was our childhood. And so they started a reading series in 1988. And I went to, I think, every one of the readings in '88. And then I think I showed someone some of my artwork, because I draw also, and some of my writing. And they said, oh, we'd like you to join the darkroom. So in 1989, I joined the darkroom. And I was primarily writing fiction, but there were a lot of amazing poets who were part of the darkroom. And so I also started writing. I had written poetry in high school and as a child. So I was also writing poetry as well. So some of the poems date from then, and then some date from a few years later, when I went to what was called a workshop called the Cave Writers Workshop in the late 90s. And this was after I published my first book, Annotations. And the Cave Writers Workshops are dedicated to poetry. And it was a more organized, beautifully organized, I should say, workshop that originally took place during the summer. It was founded by Cornelius Eady and Toy Derricotte, two amazing poets, and brought together Black poets of all ages, right, and black broadly understood, so people from all over the Black diaspora, for a summer workshop. And then it started to expand to workshops, during the fall and spring, and they have a book prize, and now they have a series of prizes. But it's just a really amazing gathering of people. And so I wrote some more of the poems while at Cave Canem, and then had been writing poems pretty much, all along. So that's why you have a sense, I think there's a sense that, some of these poems really go back a while, and some of them are fairly new. But yeah, I write poetry all the time.
Sure. Is poetry what you would consider your primary mode? Like, I know you also write fiction. Do you even think of it that way? Is there one that you feel is your main thing, and the other thing is sort of like your side hustle, or is it all of a piece?
It's all of a piece. It's all of a piece. I mean, I've said, I think before, so forgive me for anyone who's heard me say this, but I used to, often when I would have an idea or feeling or words would come to me, I would write them as a poem. And then, this is especially when I was younger, and then I would realize, no, John, you're writing a story. This is not a poem. And now I think I have a much clearer sense that, this is going to be a poem, or I want to, do this. This is going to be a story, because I really have a narrative I want to work through and explore. But I feel that they're of a piece, And this is something I think, that I appreciate about the approach to writing in the past, is that many writers, tried it all, right? They wrote stories, they wrote novels, they wrote poems, they wrote plays, they wrote journalism, they wrote essays. Some of them were even scholars and wrote scholarly writing. So you have really the entire range of things, memoirs, right? All kinds of nonfiction. And then, of course, there were always people who were much more specialists, right, in one area or another. And I try to always say to my students and say to myself, right, you write what you're compelled to write. You write what you're drawn to write. You write what sometimes you need to write. That's the important thing. And it might not always work or be what you were hoping for, but there was a reason why you wrote what you wrote. And, honor that, hold fast to that, and just keep going.
I want to talk to you about a theme in this book that really stood out to me, and that is this theme of survival. Mm-hmm. Several of the poems deal with the AIDS crisis of the late 80s and the early 90s. You can definitely feel echoes of it in multiple poems. There's also the issue of violence against Black people, violence against queer people, and all that entails. And then there's also, on a related note, and I don't know if this filtered in because I don't know how recently you were working on any of these poems, but I couldn't help but think about what we've been living through with COVID, and the way that COVID in the pandemic is an echo of the AIDS crisis, both in terms of its disruption to everyday life and also in the ways that it has impacted disproportionately people of color. So, that's kind of a big question, but I just would like to hear you talk about this theme of survival and the ways in which you're reckoning with it.
That's a great question. So I think that, right, survival is a recurrent theme. And of course, it makes sense as a Black person living in this society. It's something I live with every day. I think it's important that you mention the AIDS pandemic in relation to, COVID-19. I mean, one of the things that I think was very significant to me in 2020 when we first, encountered COVID was the government's response. And it reminded me so much of what I recalled in the 1980s, right? This sort of dismissal of what was happening, the lies, the bumbling, et cetera. Okay. And it was very clear that people were dying, right? In disproportionate numbers, Black, and other BIPOC people, right? Working class and poor people, the frontline workers, right? The people whose lives, basically were on the line, people who couldn't work from home were dying. And there was this sort of strange, I'm not even talking about the anti-vax people, or the people, the COVID denialists, but, from the government, this sort of strange kind of non-response or dismissal, playing it down. And it really felt like, what I remembered from the early 80s, right? I was in high school then, but I mean, it was very clear to me that, yes, researchers were taking this seriously, and the people who were dying from, AIDS were taking this seriously. But the government, it was the government silence and inaction. And, so if I had a feeling of PTSD, and, that's something I think that, like, the question is, how do you convey that, right? How do you convey that feeling of threat, that feeling of menace, that feeling of, a feeling of almost like bare life, right? But also, one of the things that I wanted to do in this book, and I want to stress this, is to suggest that alongside the portrayal of, the struggle to survive, I also wanted to show moments of joy. I also wanted to show moments of happiness. I also wanted to show that, a kind of sense of people thriving, right, in the midst of the very worst things, the greatest tragedies, right, that people didn't give up. We don't give up. I mean, of course, some people are crushed by, the forces out there, right? But I wanted to show that this was more than just, accounts of the most horrible things, right, that we go through, that I've gone through, that we all go through, that Black people go through, and to say that yes, no, we still have this incredible capacity for love, to appreciate the world, to experience joy, particularly with each other, right? Same with, LGBTQ people, that it's not all doom and gloom, So I maybe that's a kind of roundabout answer to what you asked, but I've thought about this a lot, because again, someone had asked me, I think, about the question of elegy, right? And I realized, of course, there are a number of elegies in here, but I didn't want this to be a book that was not simply, but was a collection of elegies, right? There's an elegiac tone in aspects of this book, or places in this book, but it's not only a collection of elegies, right? It's a collection of a range of sort of possibilities of how one might portray a life and lives, right? How one might portray experiences, right? And, I wanted to draw on a range of poetic forms, right? Poetic genres and forms to do that.
Well, and if you're exploring the subject or the theme of survival, elegy might be part of it, but celebration is part of our coping strategy as well. I mean, if all we're ever doing is mourning, it's going to be pretty difficult to survive. And sometimes I think there's something heroic, like particularly heroic, about finding reasons to be happy or finding reasons to celebrate and cut against whatever forces out there might be bearing down in dark ways. So I don't know. I think, again, it gets back to this feeling of completeness and this feeling of having been given, from your perspective, a pretty total picture. Oh, look at your cat sniffing the microphone.
Yes, this cat has to make an appearance, and now yes, she is sniffing the microphone. And as you see,
what's her name?
Her name is Cammie.
Oh, hi, Cammie.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. I find that, again, more true to life, to have these more celebratory moments captured, and countenanced against the more elegiac or somber images or poems or moments. And when they reflect off of one another, it delivers a sense of heightened power. That's all I can really say about it. You know, they really, like, the lower moments feel more poignant, and the higher moments feel higher when you have them working off of one another.
Well, thank you. And one other thing, you actually, I think, touched upon something that I find fascinating. You sort of picked up a kind of what we could say an undercurrent here, a subtext with these poems. One of the earlier versions of this collection was titled Heroic Figures. And I thought about it. I said, you know, with this, should I keep Heroic Figures? And I thought, no, I'll just go with a simpler one-word title. I actually love one-word titles. Let me just put that out there. But though it's new and selected poems, so it's actually several words. But I also thought, you know, punk. What if I think about punks as heroic figures, right? What does that mean, right? Punks in all those possible meanings, right? So in a sense, that idea of a certain kind of heroism runs through, right? And I also, one of the things I've also often thought about is, you know, I know in the United States there's a vogue for, there's a, you know, endless fascination with and desire for superhero stories. And I think, you know, the superheroes are all around us, right? Doing the most interesting, extraordinary things. And one of those things is surviving, you know, to survive in this society and be able to live and function and do. And, you know, I mean, that almost takes for so many of us, a super heroic effort.
Well, yeah, and that heroism can be found in somebody willing to go out dancing,
mm-hmm.
like
right.
in the midst of the AIDS crisis, for example, or people trying to find love,
right.
you know, and trying to connect with one another, despite the fact that we're all going to die, or that, you know, death is near, or society does not approve, or this, you know, or the very fact of our connection could be dangerous to us. You know, I'm thinking in particular of queer culture. Right. And then also I think of the persona section, and I think of these great artists or athletes or scientists that you're channeling who, despite the societal pressures bearing down on them, made great art and found deep meaning in their lives. I think, too, of one of the most moving poems in the collection for me, which is the poem, I believe, entitled Pulse, which is dedicated mm-hmm. to the lives lost at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando several years ago in that horrific shooting. There again, people going out dancing and demonstrating a kind of heroism, particularly when you consider what they were up against and how they lost their lives in a hail of bullets shot from a gun by somebody who didn't believe that they even had a right to exist, or who was so disturbed by them that, you know, he chose to put an end to all of their lives. So I don't know. It's just, I guess the point is that this kind of heroism that we're talking about manifests in every section of the book and in a number of ways.
Exactly. I mean, and I will say that Paul's poem is one of the newer poems, probably one of the newest poems in the collection. And I wanted to think about that, and I thought about, you know, how do you memorialize people who are killed just for being who they are? I mean, and that's, of course, that comes back to kind of, you know, one of the themes that runs through you know, throughout this entire collection. But they went out dancing, they went out to hang out, they went out to enjoy themselves. They were predominantly Latinx, I believe, and Black, and they never thought that they would never come home. Their loved ones never thought that they would never come home. But this is, you know, it also sort of points to kind of the larger, as I was saying, societal violence, you know, we live in. This is a country that's deeply shaped by, I know this is considered controversial by some people, but it shouldn't be, deeply shaped by, you know, racism and white supremacy and settler and extractive colonialism, right? You know, we live in an empire, right, that, you know, enacts violence all over the world and within its borders, right? And these violences take many forms, right? They manifest themselves in many ways, right? And you know, the violence against you know, people of color, BIPOC people, anti-Black racism, the violence against LGBTQ people, right? It's all of a piece, right? So I thought with this poem, right, you know, maybe the best way would be to think of a collective we, these voices of the living and the dead, and to portray them through just who they are, what they wear, what they do, what they hear, how they feel, right? What they listen to, and what echoes of all of this are with us after they're gone.
Could I ask you to read that poem? It seems like such a nice time to have you do that so that listeners can get a more complete picture of what we're talking about.
Sure. Pulse. For the 49 murdered and 53 wounded at the Pulse nightclub, Orlando, Florida, June 12th, 2016. We are the quiet street hours before doors open. We are the first words and the parting ones. We're the cologne and perfume selected for tonight alone. We're the fragrance of soap, Vaseline, shea butter. We're the pressed polos and tees, the freshly laced kicks. We're the pants just out of the dryer, the sweater that fits. We are the glances, the stares, the winks. We are the close cut, the Caesar and tight fade. We are the crucifix, beads, and cowrie shells. We are the knockoff watch and the 14-karat chain. We are the cordon and the gathering line. We are the sachet and the strut and the swagger. We are the foundation, mascara, and blush. We are the eye blink, the heartbeat, the hush. We are the oil glistening in locks, ponytails, and froze. We are the piercings from eyebrows to tongues to noses. We are the mouth spray, the breath mints, the gum. We are the bustier, the suspenders, the garters. We are the shades that never come off. We are the pocket scrap or the rolling paper packet. We are the X, the weed, the snowy trail. We are the bitter beer, fizzy soda, and sweet cocktail. We are the chairs rearranged to open the door. We are the sweaty brows, the half-hidden tears. We are the gleam of smartphone screens. We are the small talk, the banter, the laughter. We are the claps and the clapbacks. We are the wigs on too tight or just right. We are the improvised steps, the smoothest moves. We are the dances that precede the groove. We are the cruise, stare, and icy glare. We are the kikis and air kisses and shade. We are the gossip that cannot wait to be told. We are the static bass and reverb. We are the heat rising off of bodies nearing, touching. We are the beat that slides beneath the beat. We are the fallen lash, the broken heel, the belt cinched tight. We are the proposal for a lifetime, few minutes, or the night. We are the breath held to the end of the evening. We are the closing doors, the bolted locks. We are the silence that always remembers. We are the song that never ends.
You should be a poet.
Thank you.
I think you might have a future.
Thank you.
That's lovely and so sad because it's all these things that attach themselves to a person, like the details of lives, you know, the physical details or the like circumstantial details, whatever it is. But there's a sense of absence amid all of it that's really poignant and really sad.
Yeah.
Did you write that in the immediate aftermath, or did it take some time?
It took some time. I had to think about it. I think I wrote down notes about the horrific tragedy, but in some ways I felt so close to it. I mean, I wasn't there. I didn't know anyone who was killed, who was lost, was injured, but I felt deeply for them, as I always do when horrific tragedies like this happen. But I felt, in a sense, too close to it, and I felt like, there's a way in which, some people can, process things very quickly and write about it, and I honor those people. I think it's an amazing gift to be able to do that. But it took me a little while. I had to sit with it and then figure out, well, how do you write about this to honor all of these people who were lost, these lives that were lost, right? In their particularity, in their richness, right? But also have a poem that speaks to anyone, right? You think about the pulse, just the idea of pulse, both the nightclub, but also the pulse of the beat, right? The pulse of the music, the pulse of life itself, in spaces like Pulse. So I had to sit with it for a little bit. And then it came to me and I said, when something comes to you, if you're a writer, you want to write it down, right? Because it may, appear and disappear. So
poems, at least as I imagine them, when they do arrive, they tend to happen fast, right? I mean, I know there's a revision process that inevitably unfolds, but maybe not always. It just seems to me this way compared to, say, writing fiction or writing long form nonfiction or long form anything, that a poem can kind of show up and channel itself through you quickly.
Yes, sometimes it does happen that way. Some years ago, I worked at NYU, and what I would do, I had a boss who allowed me to post poems. I had a clear glass office, right? And so I would post a weekly poem by a different poet, that I admired, So I'd have poems by Lucille Clifton or John Ashbery, or I mentioned Cornelius, Yusuf Komunyakaa, Cornelius Eady, Toy Derricott, just a range of poets. I think one time, the poet Mace Swenson, Marianne Moore, right? So, range of people, and Jane Cortez. But what I would also do was during my lunch break, because I was right not too far from Washington Square Park, and I would sometimes walk to the park and sit and write, or find a place, I'd grab my food and then find a place, it was fairly quiet, and just write a poem, and just to have that experience of the practice of writing daily and writing during short periods of time. And sometimes, it's just like you have a feeling, you have, as I said, a line or word or, a phrase will come to you and you just write it down. And that doesn't mean that it's going to be a great poem or, it's even it'll work at all. But I would try to do that. And then, of course, sometimes would have what became, I think a few of these poems emerged from that experience. And then other times it was like, no, this just doesn't work at all. But then sometimes you realize, okay, I need to just, after I've written it down, I need to set it aside and come back to it. And the process of revision can do wonders. So I've said, there are a series of poems in here that I call postcard poems. And I got the idea of postcard poems many years ago from a reading about the late German poet Peter Altenberg, who wrote postcard poems. I think this is directly where I took the idea. And I had one poem, I think it was just called Postcard, right? And it was a series of sections. And for whatever reason, I couldn't get it to work. And then when I was working on this book, I said, revision, these are a series of separate poems. Break it up into these individual postcards, because they're postcards, John. They should be short. Come on. I mean, it's like the idea is there. The text is there. Follow your own, your mind. Follow the path, that you set out for yourself. I mean, it's here. All the clues are here. So, and that was an instance where revision actually was really important, because then I realized, okay, no, I have a series of poems here as opposed to one big poem that doesn't work. And they are little postcards. And in revising them, I actually had a ball revising. I had a lot of fun revising them, and I think they each work as little individual postcards.
Well, yeah. And once again, the issue of time comes to mind in the way that things can take longer than we wish that they would as writers sometimes, but that's often a blessing in disguise. And everything's on its own clock, isn't it? It's like things come together the way that they're supposed to when it's ready, or at least that's the way you hope it happens. But it's funny to have an answer like that, a creative solution kind of staring you in the face. But it takes a while for it to become apparent, Right.
Well, capitalism wants us to work quickly and be super productive and churn out things, and not everyone works that way, right? Some people are able to be very productive and do work at a very high level and work quickly. And I honor that. I think that's an amazing gift, and I treasure those writers and those works, those artists and those works. But some of us move at a different pace, and sometimes, right? Even if you try to, you push yourself to try to follow the kind of the pace that's set out for you, the paces that are set out for you, and it doesn't work, right? You have to have some space to think, to reflect, to revise, to actually get to where you really want to and need to go.
I want to ask you a little bit more about your process. You talked about hanging out in Washington Square Park with your notebook and writing a poem. And I think this sounds a little bit like an apprenticeship mode. Like, you're learning how to do it, and you're also learning the kind of muscle memory of just sitting down to write on a regular basis and trying to write poems. But when you reflect on your body of work and the way that you get the work done, are there some consistent elements you can point to? Like everything from like practical stuff, like schedule, to more aesthetic concerns. Like, do poems typically occur to you or begin with a word, a line, a feeling, like, just so that listeners at home who might be poets or aspiring poets themselves can get a sense of how you actually do it?
Well, I don't have a set schedule for writing, particularly writing poetry. I mean, with fiction, I feel like I have to, dedicate time to it because it takes a while, and I'm a slow writer. So I really do have to. I mean, I wish I could write fiction more quickly. So often with poems, I feel like, and over the years, I just feel like I've always been writing them kind of in the interstices of everything else. But one of the things I do try to do consistently still is, keep a notebook, write in my notebook, just jot down all kinds of things, phrases, like I said, sometimes, poetry is a technology of feeling, and it emerges from feeling. And so one of the things that I try to do, right, is if there's a particular feeling or mood, that kind of comes over me, I try to write that down, right? Lines, language itself, poetry is built up of language. So I try to, record interesting words, lines from other poets are always inspirations. And other poets' work is an inspiration. So whenever I'm reading other people's poetry, I take notes in the margins of their work, and then sometimes we'll take notes. Often we'll take notes in my own little notebook, And sometimes, you just think, wow, this person is a really great poet. I'm so glad I read this person. And then, of course, when you, set their book aside, you realize, oh my God, not only did I love this book, not only, did I appreciate their prowess as a poet, but actually it's got me thinking, and it's got my mind working about, what I might do. I also do things like, I like little poetic exercises. I do this with fiction as well, so try to write a poem that is nothing but metaphors, or try to write a poem that's nothing that uses anaphora, where you have, repetition. So just to give you one example of that, I have a poem in here that I actually asked the editor, can I include it? Would it work? And they said, yeah, we think it'll work. And I was like, okay. But I had sent it out to try to get it published. It's called Gift. And it includes the anaphoric statement, I enclose, right? So it's a gift. It really is a gift to the reader. And just playing like that, like, what do you come up with when you use a very simple tool like repetition, or, the various tools of rhetoric, right? I think when I was at Cave Canem, I wrote a poem. I realized that, that when you repeat the words at the end of a line, it's called epistrophe, which to me, I was associate with that famous composition by Thelonious Monk. So it's like, oh, wow, epistrophe, the thing, right. This wonderful, syzygy between epistrophe, Monk's epistrophe, and epistrophe, this particular type of repetition. And the poem didn't work, but I just loved that kind of play, those kinds of play. So I think, one of the things I also try to do, and I would urge all poets to do this, is just play, allow your mind to be open and free, no matter what you're tackling, because sometimes, that might be the route to figure out how to write something, even something very, very serious like that Pulse poem, through allowing yourself to open up and take any approach, even approaches that you otherwise wouldn't take.
So quickly, I just want to clarify. You mentioned Cave Canem, and I know we talked about the Darkroom Collective earlier. Are those two things? Those are two separate things, or are they related?
Yes, they're two separate things. Some of the people involved with the Darkroom later had connections to Cave Canem, but Cave Canem was its own wonderful autonomous, and is its own wonderful autonomous organization, and it was founded, I want to say, in 1996 by Toy Derricotte and Cornelius Eady.
Okay,
and it still exists. Yes.
Did you say that earlier? Am I crazy, or did you?
I did mention that, but yes, no. But I'm glad to mention it again.
Okay, yeah. I just want to make sure people listening are oriented. And then, when you were saying about keeping an open mind, and I think to myself this phrase "notice what you notice," which I think is so much to do with how we write, whether it's poetry or fiction or nonfiction. But I noticed there is a poem in the collection called Grinder, I believe, which felt to me very much culled from the experience of using the Grinder app. I could be totally wrong here, but it felt like a very genius melding of poetry and technology. So you talk about like observing, being out in the world and observing and noticing what you notice, but also noticing what we notice when we're interacting with technology, which is what we do so much of the time. I'm curious to know if that's an outlier for you, like this poem Grinder, or if it's something you find yourself doing more and more, is, looking to technology for inspiration or finding poems inside of these sort of everyday technological interactions that we have.
Well, that's a great question. So I will say this. A few years ago, I actually wrote a paper. I was very interested in, Black writers who were exploring technology. I mean, there've been some very, very interesting studies about, the relationship between various kinds of electronic technologies and poetry. And in most of these books, they don't deal with any writing by Black writers or writers of color. And so I wrote a paper about this. And many years ago, when I first started, I had a blog, or still have a blog, but, I was playing with things like, the GIFs, GIFs or GIFs. I was making poems out of GIFs. There's a credible artistic team, Mindy and Keith Obadike, and they created these incredible poems, fascinating, like online poems. And I think there's one poem that actually I wrote about where, depending on where the cursor is, certain things show up and certain things don't. So it's almost like an erasure poem. The poem has this really kind of powerful content, but depending on how where you put the cursor, you see certain things and don't see certain things. So I've been interested in this for a while. And at a certain point I realized, looking at it, like an app like Grindr, it's like, this language is just so, on a certain level, so absurd and so fascinating. So I will say with that poem, I as I said, I collect these things, I call these things, I write everything down, and I compiled the language, and then I was at Image Text Ithaca, which is a wonderful program founded by Catherine Taylor and Nicholas Milner at Ithaca College that really melds art and text, right? And brings in, writers and photographers and visual artists, et cetera. And they do all kinds of filmmakers. They just all kinds of fascinating things. And I was talking with Nicholas Milner, and I said, hey, I've got this language, and it makes a poem. And he had photographs that actually were somewhat similar, right, where people were sort of showing everything, but their faces were pixelated out. So we actually did a little book called Grind. And then when it came time to put this book together, I thought, well, I'll just go without the images, right? Because there's nothing else in the book has images, but the text itself sort of works on its own. So I slightly revised that a little bit. But yeah, it's like I love that poem. To me is sort of one of my favorites, because on one level it's so absurd, and another level it's so profound. It's there's so much intimate material there, and then there's so much material that actually sort of pushes people away. And I feel like that's how technology works in a sense. We feel sometimes so close, but then of course, it's also so mediated, right? So I feel like that poem captures that experience.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not somebody who's used Grindr, but it felt familiar to me. I was like, oh yeah, I recognize this. I mean, there's something about
Grindr, Tinder, all of it. Yeah.
Whatever it is, the self-presentation of the internet and the way that we build self on the internet. And I think, interestingly, from a writerly perspective, the way that these different technology platforms engender their own culture and their own dialects almost. The users of these platforms generate this stuff, and it becomes like the lingua franca among different users of these sites, and I find myself adopting them. You kind of just do it intuitively. But it's very interesting from a poetic or writerly perspective to take that stuff and then to try to reconstitute it into a poem. And that one was great because it's like really sad, but also really funny. There's a great sadness and loneliness in dating apps and hookup apps or whatever, but also just the internet, period.
And I love that you mentioned that it's funny. I mean, that's one of the things I was hoping for, right? Is that, right, I mean, I want you, it's sad, it's, it's kind of cringy, but on the other hand, I also, it's like we're saying, absurd. It's like, it's often quite funny. Like the things that people say, it's like, what are you doing? But then on the other hand, you realize, no, I mean, they're human, right? I understand what you're doing. This is not going to help you, everybody, but okay, I can't look away. So,
Before I let you go, I want to talk a little bit about your bio, and I always like to know a little bit about the writers that I'm talking with in terms of just where they're from, how you formed, how you got to poetry in your life. It sounds like, I think you said earlier, it started in your adolescence, but I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, you are from the Midwest. You're a St. Louis native, is that correct?
Yep, born and reared in St. Louis, Missouri.
Okay, so I'm a Midwestern guy too. I was born in Milwaukee, but divided my childhood between Milwaukee and Indianapolis. I can remember class trips to St. Louis when I was a kid, and St. Louis was sort of exotic. Like the arch in St. Louis was like the Arc de Triomphe as far as I was concerned, But tell me a little bit about your upbringing and your family life.
Well, I was born in St. Louis, Missouri. And my parents were born there. St. Louis is an interesting place because it is very Midwestern, but it's also very Southern, right? So you get that. It's a really fascinating combination. Kansas City is somewhat similar, but Kansas City, I feel like, is a little bit more Western, right? And, other cities are like Chicago. I mean, Chicago is and St. Louis have commonalities. Milwaukee and St. Louis have commonalities. But yes, you really get that feeling of both the Midwest and the South in St. Louis.
And I should say, too, that speaks to me very directly because I always try to emphasize this when I'm telling people about the part of my youth that unfolded in Indianapolis. That, too, has a very Southern vibe. And I say this with some authority because my parents are from Louisiana. And so I was keen, I had my familiarity with it there. It's like, these places like latitudinally are pretty far north, but there's Southern culture in a place like St. Louis. There's Southern culture in a place like Indianapolis in ways that there is not for Chicago and Milwaukee. I feel like those are fully upper Midwest, but it's definitely got Southern flavor.
Right. And I would say, if you look at the Black communities in almost all of those cities, and this includes Cleveland, Cincinnati, right? The Great Migration transformed these cities, right? Detroit, it transformed these cities. So, everyone I knew had relatives, every Black person at least I know, who, had relatives in the South, right? You grew up in St. Louis, but you had relatives, in Arkansas and Mississippi, Louisiana, Tennessee. And then, of course, even in Chicago, the South Side of Chicago, a huge portion of the people in the South Side of Chicago come directly from Mississippi. Their ancestors came from Mississippi. So that actually sort of shaped the culture profoundly. I would say, I was born and grew up in the city of St. Louis. And then at a certain point, my parents moved to the suburbs. So I also had a suburban, childhood and adolescence. I had both. I was raised Roman Catholic.
As was I.
Yeah. Milwaukee, St. Louis is very Catholic. They're both very Catholic cities. But I had, relatives who were not Catholic, like my grandparents. So, of course, I also, I tell people at one point, it felt like there was this dual, in my experience where on the one hand, the Catholic priests and nuns were telling us, that anyone who's not Catholic is, basically like an infidel. And then, of course, I went to the local community Baptist church, and I was like, maybe I should get baptized. So anyway, it's like this is a very interesting experience with religion growing up. I drew before I ever wrote anything. I was drawing at 18 months old, and I still draw from time to time. One point I figured out, how to draw with my finger on my phone. So I had like I had these little drawings I would, do when I was commuting. And I was writing when I was very young, writing poems, my own little stories and things like this. And wrote all through junior high, high school, college, and then after college. So that's sort of my experience. And I would say that, I've said this before, so forgive me again, people have heard me say this, but I think the idea of being a writer was not anything that crossed my mind even when I was in high school. And there were, of course, famous writers who had come from St. Louis, but the idea that, I could be Black and be a writer, even though, I was, as a child, introduced to like this amazing corpus of Black culture. This was during the 1970s, during that period of very sort of pro-Black period, the period coming out of the Black arts movement. I had an introduction to just everything from my parents and aunts and uncles. But the thought that I could become a writer was not at all a possibility. And then when I was a senior in college, I took a class with Ishmael Reed. And it was kind of like a surreal experience because he was such a great teacher, and an amazing person. But also, here was a Black writer right in front of me, who was actively writing and encouraging us and everything. So I think that also sort of transformed my perspective on what was possible.
When that was at Harvard?
Yes.
Okay. So you got from St. Louis to Harvard. That was something you were set a goal to do? I feel like people who go to Harvard are thinking about it from a young age. Or how did it happen for you?
That's a good question. Well, so I went to a all boys Catholic high school in St. Louis. When I was maybe about 13, my father and I were in, it wasn't Marshall's. Maybe it was Marshall's. I don't know. It was one of those stores, maybe Target. And they had the T-shirts, college T-shirts with the different, college logos on them. And he said, you can, pick out a few, right? So, of course, one of the ones I picked out, I think, was University of Michigan. And then I also picked Washington University, of course, which is based in St. Louis. And I think I picked out Harvard, right? And I don't know why I picked out Harvard, but I was like, okay, maybe, So then when I was a senior in high school, junior in high school and senior in high school, I thought, where do I want to go to college? And I think what my guidance counselor was saying, I was a good student, and my guidance counselor was suggesting certain schools. And I think Washington University was sort of in my head. Howard was another school I thought about, Northwestern, University of Chicago. So low schools in the area, great schools in the area. And then I said, you know what, I'm going to apply to Harvard. So I applied to Harvard early and got in. And then my father, they had a sort of gathering for the pre-freshmen who had gotten in, I think early, the freshmen who had gotten in early. And my father and I flew up there to see the campus, and we walked around, and I was like, this is far away from home. I'm going here. So, yeah. So I got, some scholarships to go. Although, it's a very different situation now than then, because it's a lot more expensive now. But given my parents' salary, they didn't make a lot of money. I would have had to pay nothing, whereas back then, I still had to take out loans and things like that, because Harvard didn't cover, even if you didn't make a lot of money, they didn't cover everything. So, but yeah, that's where I went.
Wow.
And it was wonderful aspects of it and not so fun aspects of it, but yeah, I'm glad I went.
And Ishmael Reed changed your life when you were a senior.
Yes. He was a remarkable teacher. I had many, many great professors, but he was, I would say, probably one of the most amazing, because he was so encouraging, about everything.
And what about your queer identity? Growing up in the Midwest, you say, I hear Catholic boys' school and just being in the Midwest and in that era. Was this something that you were open about, or was it something that came later?
Oh yeah, no, I think it was when I got to college. I think, I don't think I would be surprising anyone to say that, being like openly gay, queer, bi, trans in the 1980s, in the middle, anywhere, right?
Right.
Well, anywhere at any age was an easy thing. I mean, because of course this was the Reagan era, and this was the era like when I was maybe a sophomore in high school was when the first reports of AIDS came out. So of course there was a huge homophobic backlash. I think I was very aware of it. At the same time, as a young person, I think, I said, I'm going to sort of explore. And so, we didn't have the internet back then. I mean, it makes me sound like I'm like 100 years old, but, you go, there were places, St. Louis, where you could go read magazines, gay magazines, not like sex magazines, but just, like the New York, what was it? The New York Native. I think that was one of the magazines. Christopher Street was another one, right? Places that sold those. And then just sort of kind of slowly realizing there was like, a gay, queer, demi-monde in St. Louis and in Boston, that sort of beneath the surface of what you saw, there was this whole other world, or these other worlds. So, but yeah, I think I had to, that was one of the reasons I think it was good to get away from home, which is the thing I always say, just for young people overall, is just, finding places where you can be yourself is really, really crucial, right? Where you can sort of thrive. And even in college, I think there was, Harvard at the time, the LGBTQ, I don't know if the Q part was there yet, but the LGBT student organizations were active, but not like they probably would be today. But I think it was a very interesting time to be a young person, and particularly young gay person, young queer person. Right?
Well, this conversation, I think, is going to end close to where your poetry collection begins, which is in those early days and in Boston and in the 80s and 90s. I have so enjoyed talking with you, and I want to congratulate you again on this collection, which feels like a life's work to date in many ways and contains so much. So kudos to you. Thanks for your generosity and conversation and for spending time talking with me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Brad. It's been such a pleasure.
All right. That is John Keene. And his new book is called Punks, New and Selected Poems, available now from The Song Cave. You can follow John on Instagram. I believe his handle over there is @JSTheater. For more information on his book, just go to the Song Cave's website. It's the-song-cave.com. One more time, the book is called Punks, New and Selected Poems. It is excellent. Go get your copy right now. This podcast is offered freely. Did you know that? Every single episode, the entire archive, is available to you, the listener, for free. It's a listener-supported show, so if you like this show, if you listen regularly, if you get something from it, I hope you will consider supporting the show over at Patreon. You can do that for as little as $1 a month. The web address is patreon.com/otherpplpod. Patreon, patreon.com/otherpplpod. There are different tiers, different levels of support. $1 a month, $3, $5, $10, and so on up the scale. As you move up that scale, you can get stuff: a t-shirt, a tote bag, a coffee mug, a book club subscription. I will write you a letter. I will sing you happy birthday. Patreon.com/otherpplpod. Don't forget, too, if you would be so kind, to pre-order my new novel, Be Brief and Tell Them Everything. Just go to bradlisti.com. Everything is right there. Use whatever online bookseller you prefer and help the cause. This podcast has its own email newsletter. I do a weekly email newsletter. Did you know that? You should sign up for it. It's free. Just click on email newsletter in the left sidebar over at the show's official website, otherppl.com. You can also sign up for it at bradlisti.com. Same deal. Just click on email newsletter over in the sidebar. This podcast also has its own official app. Are you aware of this? It's free. The Otherppl with Brad Listi app. Go get it wherever you get your apps. It's a good app. The Otherppl podcast also has its own YouTube channel. The entire archive is available on YouTube. If you're a YouTube person, please go over there and search for the show by name, Otherppl with Brad Listi. Subscribe to the channel. It's free. Just push the subscribe button. It helps the cause. It also helps the cause if you rate and review the show over at Apple Podcasts or Stitcher or wherever you listen. So if you have a minute, rate and review the show. It helps other people find it. The more ratings, the better the show does in the algorithm or something like that. So, great conversation with John Keene. It was nice to hear him read his poems, wasn't it? Every time that happens, I'm like, I gotta have more poets on this show. We could use a little poetry in the world right now. So, thanks for listening. I've got some good ones in the pipeline. Stay tuned, and I will talk to you soon.